Alright, so I'm gonna tell you guys something that happened to me about 2 years ago, and I still think about it almost every single day. Not in a bitter way, not anymore, but in that way where you replay something and you're like, damn, life really does have a sense of humor. I need you to stay with me on this one, because it starts slow. It starts with a mailbox, and it ends somewhere I never could have predicted, standing in that parking lot, holding a cream-colored envelope that smelled faintly of someone else's expensive perfume. My name is Joseph Wright. I was 34 years old, 5th grade teacher, West Philadelphia. And before you picture anything dramatic, let me paint you the actual picture of my life at that time, because it matters. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a dent on the rear left panel that I kept saying I'd fix and never did. The paint was fading in that specific way where it looked almost intentional in certain lighting, like the car had character. I shopped at thrift stores not because I had to, but because I genuinely liked it. There's something about finding a perfectly good flannel shirt for $4 that feels like winning. My apartment in West Philadelphia had one bedroom, a kitchen where one of the burners was slightly tilted, and a window that faced a brick wall. I knew my neighbors by name. I knew which step on the staircase creaked. I knew the sound of Mrs. Rodriguez's shopping cart rolling across the lobby tile at 6:15 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because she was the most punctual woman I'd ever met in my life. That was my world. And I want you to understand, I wasn't unhappy in it. That's the part that confuses people when I tell this story. They assume I must have been miserable, just waiting for something to change. But I genuinely wasn't. I had my classroom, my kids, my routines. I had peace. What I didn't have, what I hadn't had in 18 months, was closure. Her name was Brittany Lawson, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to spend too much time making her sound like a monster, because that's not really what she was. She was something more complicated than a monster. She was someone who had decided, very early in life, that love was a transaction, that you offered yourself to the highest bidder and called it a relationship. We'd been together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months. I had bought the ring from a small jewelry shop in Center City, owned by this old Vietnamese man named Mr. Thuc, who had been making rings since before I was born. It wasn't flashy. It was a simple band with a single round-cut diamond, and when Mr. Thuc handed it to me in that little velvet box, he said, "This one has a good feeling. I can tell." I believed him. I really did. Brittany wore it for 4 months before she handed it back to me on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the edge of the couch in her apartment with a tone of voice that I can only describe as clinical. Not angry, not sad. Clinical. "Joseph, I've been thinking a lot, and I need someone with more drive. Someone who can give me the life I deserve." Those words, the life I deserve. I remember how naturally they came out of her. Like she'd rehearsed them. Like she'd said them to herself in the mirror enough times that they stopped feeling cruel. I didn't argue. That's the thing I'm most proud of from that night. I didn't argue. I just sat there, and I felt something in my chest sort of settle, like a heavy object finally finding the floor after falling for a long time. I put the ring in my pocket. I drove home. And that was that. 2 months later, she was posting photos with Dr. Trevor Montgomery. Charity galas. Weekend trips to Montego Bay. Him in a perfectly tailored navy blazer, her in a backless dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The comments were full of people saying things like goals and she deserves this and all of that. I unfollowed her page on a rainy Wednesday morning without ceremony, like throwing away expired coupons. I moved on, or I thought I did. 18 months passed, and then I went downstairs to check my mail on a Thursday evening in late September, wearing an old Howard University t-shirt and gym shorts, carrying the mental residue of a long day of explaining fractions to 10-year-olds. The lobby of my building smelled like it always did, a mix of the pine cleaner the super used on Mondays and someone on the second floor who cooked a lot of cumin. The fluorescent light above the mailboxes had been flickering for about 3 weeks and maintenance kept saying they'd fix it. I flipped through the stack. Electric bill. A flyer for a pizza place I'd never been to. A reminder about the building's water shut-off next Friday. And then, this envelope. Cream-colored. Thick. The kind of paper that costs money just to touch, like it was made from something that had been carefully pressed and dried over a long time. My name was written on the front in gold calligraphy, Joseph Wright. There was no return address, just a small, gold-embossed monogram in the corner, B&T. I stood there under that flickering light and opened it. The invitation itself was elaborate. Vineyard wedding in Napa Valley, October 14th, Dr. Trevor James Montgomery and Brittany Nicole Lawson request the honor of your presence. There was a dress code, black tie. Accommodations suggested at a nearby hotel. The whole thing had the energy of someone who wanted you to understand, before you even arrived, that this event cost a great deal of money. But it was the note that fell out when I unfolded the invitation that changed the temperature of the room. A single card, smaller than the invitation, written in her handwriting, that precise, slightly backward slant she always had, like her letters were leaning away from whoever was reading them. Jamal, I wanted you to see what my life has become. Trevor gives me everything I deserve. I know this might be hard for you, poor thing, but I'd love for you to come celebrate with us. It might inspire you to finally make something of yourself. Bring a date if you can find someone willing. B. She'd used the wrong name. Jamal. After 3 years together and 8 months engaged, she'd written the wrong name on the card. I don't know if that was deliberate or careless. Looking back, I think it was both. That's how little I occupied her mind by then. I was just the poor ex who needed a name, and any name would do. I stood there in that lobby for a long time. Long enough that the flickering light above the mailboxes went through about 40 cycles. I was aware of the cold tile under my bare feet. I'd come down without shoes, which I never do. I was aware of the distant sound of a TV from someone's apartment upstairs. I was aware of my own heartbeat, which was oddly calm. And I was aware of one other thing. A thought that rose up from somewhere I hadn't accessed in a long time. Slow at first, then with a kind of quiet certainty that felt almost like gravity. She has no idea. Here's the thing I haven't told you yet. The thing that nobody in my day-to-day life knew. Except for 2 people. My lawyer, David Kim, a meticulous Korean-American man in his late 40s who communicated primarily in precise clipped sentences, and my financial advisor, Gloria Reyes, who had the specific energy of someone who had seen too many rich people make terrible decisions and was determined to prevent me from becoming one of them. 7 years before that night in the lobby, when I was 27 years old, I had sold a company. Its name was LearnBridge. It was an educational software platform I'd built over 4 years, started it in my graduate school apartment on a second-hand laptop, grew it through nights and weekends and more rejections than I care to count, and eventually sold it to a mid-size educational technology firm for $18 million. $18 million. I know how that sounds when you say it out loud. Trust me, it sounded just as surreal to me the day I signed the papers, sitting in a conference room that smelled like recycled air and coffee, watching David slide the documents across the table with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before. 2 months before that sale closed, my grandmother Evelyn had called me to her hospital bed. She was 81 years old, and she had the kind of face that had seen everything twice. Deep lines around her eyes, hands that were always slightly cold, a voice that came from somewhere low and settled, like words formed in the chest before they ever reached the mouth. She held my hand and she said, "Don't let money change who you are, Joseph. Stay in real work, with real people, at least 10 years. Promise me." I promised her. She passed 2 months later, 9 days after the LearnBridge sale closed. So I kept the money quiet. I kept teaching. I kept the Honda. I kept the apartment. I set up everything through David and Gloria. Investments, anonymous donations, a trust structure that kept my name off anything public. And for 7 years, I lived like a man of modest means because I genuinely believed that was where the most honest version of me existed. I never told Brittany. Not because I didn't trust her, at least not in the beginning, but because by the time the money existed, something in me already understood at a level below words that she wasn't in love with me. She was in love with the idea of upgrading me. And you can't tell someone who's trying to trade up that you're already worth more than they're looking for. It doesn't work that way. I went back upstairs to my apartment. I put the invitation on the kitchen counter. I made tea, red bush, the kind my grandmother used to drink. And I sat at the small table by the window that faced the brick wall, and I just thought. I thought about the 3 years. I thought about Mr. Thuk and the ring with the good feeling. I thought about the way she'd handed it back to me, clinical and clean, like returning a library book slightly before the due date. I thought about that note. Poor thing. Finally make something of yourself. Bring a date if you can find someone willing. And then I picked up my phone and I called Marcus Webb, my best friend since freshman year of college at Temple University. 6'2", broad-shouldered, laugh like a foghorn. The kind of man who would give you his last $20 and then act like you'd done him a favor by taking it. We'd been through everything together. Graduations, breakups, the death of his father, the sale of my company, which he celebrated with me in a Waffle House at 2 a.m., eating scattered and smothered hash browns because neither of us wanted anything fancier than that in that moment. He picked up on the second ring. "You good?" he said. That was always how he answered when he could tell from the way I called that something was happening. "I got a wedding invitation," I said. There was a pause. "From Brittany." "From Brittany." Another pause. Longer this time. "What kind of invitation?" "The kind with a handwritten note calling me poor thing and suggesting I finally make something of myself." The silence on Marcus's end lasted about 4 seconds. And then he said something that I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. "Joseph, I need you to come over, tonight. There's something I've been holding on to for a while, and I think it's time you knew about it." I drove to his place in Germantown with the windows down, even though it was cool enough that I probably should have turned the heat on. I needed the air. I needed the feel of the city moving around me, the streetlights, the corner stores still open, a man walking a dog that was too large for the leash he was using, the ordinary pulse of a Thursday night that had no idea it was about to become a turning point. Marcus lived in a row house he'd been fixing up for 3 years. 1 room at a time. The front door still needed repainting. The kitchen was beautiful. That was Marcus. He always fixed the important things first and got to the surface things when he got to them. He let me in without ceremony, handed me a beer I didn't ask for, and gestured to the kitchen table where a black external hard drive sat next to a manila folder. I looked at the hard drive. I looked at Marcus. "Sit down, man," he said. "This is going to take a minute." And that's when everything I thought I knew about the last 18 months started to crack open at the seams. Stay with me. Because what Marcus had been sitting on, quietly for over a year, was the kind of thing that changes how you understand every single conversation you thought you had, every silence you mistook for nothing, every moment you told yourself you were imagining things. He sat down across from me and put both hands flat on the table, the way people do when they're about to say something they've been rehearsing in their head for a long time and they're not sure the words are going to come out right. Marcus is not a dramatic man. That's the thing you need to understand about him before I tell you what he said. He is the least dramatic person I have ever known in my life. He doesn't exaggerate. He doesn't embellish. When he tells you something, it's because it's true and because he's already thought about it from every angle and decided you needed to know. So when he sat down across from me with that expression, somewhere between heavy and careful, I felt something shift in my stomach before he even opened his mouth. He looked at the hard drive. Then he looked at me. She was already talking to Trevor before she left you. 7 words. Flat. Delivered without theatrics, the way you'd read a medical result out loud. I didn't say anything. I just held my beer and let the sentence land. "How long before?" I asked. He exhaled through his nose. "At least 6 months. Maybe closer to 7. 7 months. We had still been engaged. I had still been calling Mr. Thok's shop occasionally, asking about sizing adjustments for the band because Brittany had mentioned once casually that it felt slightly loose. 7 months of her building an exit route while I was asking a jeweler about ring sizing. I set the beer down. I was aware of the specific weight of my own arms, like they'd gotten heavier in the last 30 seconds. "How do you know this?" I asked. Marcus opened the manila folder. What was inside was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected, honestly. Screenshots of texts, maybe, or something secondhand. But this was different. There were printed emails. Printed because Marcus didn't trust digital copies to stay organized, and he'd always been that way about important things. The emails were between Brittany and a woman named Cynthia Park, who I vaguely remembered as a friend of hers from a graduate school program she'd done years before. Someone she'd mentioned in passing maybe twice in 3 years. Never significant enough to be a full character in the story of our life together. Apparently Cynthia was the person she told everything to. I'm not going to quote every email. Some things I still don't want to put into words, even now, even to you all. But I'll tell you what mattered. There was an email from 8 months before the breakup, 2 months before she'd even mentioned feeling distant, where Brittany described meeting Trevor at a benefit gala for a children's hospital. She described him in that specific way people write when they're trying to pretend they're just making an observation, but they're actually cataloging an opportunity. He's a thoracic surgeon, comes from old money out of Connecticut. You can just tell by the way he holds a room that he's used to being the most important person in it. There was an email from 6 months before the breakup where she wrote, I need to find the right moment to end things with Joseph. I don't want to be cruel about it, but I also can't keep investing time in a direction that has no ceiling. No ceiling. That's what she said. I was a direction with no ceiling. There was an email from 3 months before the breakup where she was already describing Trevor as practically her boyfriend, talking about a weekend they'd spent in the Hamptons, talking about how his apartment in Rittenhouse Square had a chef's kitchen and floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who remembered her name after the second visit. And there was one final email sent 4 days before she sat on the edge of her couch and handed me back my ring, where she wrote, I'm doing it this week. I've been kind about it long enough. He's a good man, but good isn't enough. I'm not built for ordinary. I'm not built for ordinary. I read that line 3 times. Not because it surprised me, but because it was so precisely, completely her, that particular blend of self-mythology and coldness that she'd always carried, that I'd spent 3 years misreading as ambition. Marcus was watching me carefully from across the table. He had the look of a man waiting to see whether a building he'd just told you was unstable was actually going to fall. How did you get these? I asked. My voice was steadier than I felt. Cynthia Park, he said. Remember I went to that alumni mixer at Temple about a year ago? She was there. We got to talking. She'd had a falling out with Brittany by then. Something about money, I don't know the full details. She knew Brittany and I were close through you. She'd been sitting on these for a while and I think she just needed someone to give them to. And you didn't tell me. He met my eyes. No, I didn't. Why? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different texture. Lower, more careful. Because you were healing, Joseph, you were actually doing all right. You'd stopped checking her Instagram, you'd stopped bringing her up. You were back in your classroom, you were happy with your kids. And I kept thinking, what does knowing this actually give you? What does it change? He paused. But then you called me tonight and you read me that note she put in the envelope. And I thought, she's still doing it. She's still looking for ways to make you feel small. And you deserve to walk into that situation knowing every single thing I know. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, a car with a bass-heavy sound system rolled down the street and faded. There's more, Marcus said. He put his hand on the hard drive. This is the part where I have to take a breath even now, just telling you all this. Because what was on that hard drive was not about Brittany. It was about Trevor. Marcus had a friend, a guy named Darnell, who worked in medical billing. Not at Trevor's hospital, but at a billing clearinghouse that processed claims from multiple hospitals and private practices in the Philadelphia and South Jersey area. Darnell was the kind of man who noticed patterns in data the way other people noticed weather, instinctively, without trying. And about 14 months ago, he'd started noticing something that didn't sit right with him. Trevor Montgomery's surgical practice had been submitting insurance claims with a specific pattern of irregularities, procedures billed at premium rates for complications that weren't documented in patient records. time codes that didn't align with anesthesia logs, duplicate claims on cases that had been partially covered by a different provider, the kind of thing that if you saw it once you might explain away. If you saw it across 47 cases over 18 months, you started asking different questions. Darnell had documented everything, not because he knew anyone involved personally. He didn't. He'd done it because it was the right thing to do, and because he'd been trying to figure out who to report it to without getting himself buried in legal exposure before he could get the information to the right place. Through a chain of conversations that I still find almost impossible to believe happened organically, Darnell mentioning it to a mutual contact, that contact mentioning it to Marcus connecting the name to the man in Brittany's Instagram posts. All of it had ended up in a black external hard drive sitting on Marcus's kitchen table in Germantown on a Thursday night in late September. 47 cases, the estimated fraudulent billing total. According to Darnell's documentation, somewhere between $2 and $2.3 million. Predominantly from a period during and immediately after the pandemic, when claim volumes were high, oversight was stretched thin, and certain categories of surgical billing were being rubber-stamped at a rate that made irregularities easy to bury. I sat with that number for a long time. Does Darnell want to report this? I asked. He does. He's been wanting to for over a year. He just needed someone to help him navigate it without it coming back on him. And you've been sitting on this for how long? About 4 months. Marcus. I know. This is federal stuff. This isn't small. I know, Joseph. That's why I needed to be sure before I did anything. That's why I needed you to know first. I stood up. I needed to move. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the narrow alley behind his row house, a street lamp, a dumpster, a neighbor's fence with one slat missing. The most ordinary view in the world. My hands were steady. That surprised me. My hands were completely steady. What do you want to do with this? Marcus asked from behind me. And I stood there at that window for a long time. Long enough that the street lamp outside flickered once like it was asking the same question. Here's what I want to say to the guys in this forum who've been through something like this. Not the exact details, obviously, but the shape of it. The experience of finding out that what you thought was a simple ending to a chapter was actually a much more complicated story that other people had been reading while you were standing outside the library. I want to tell you that I felt angry. Because I did. There was a specific cold anger that settled in my chest in Marcus's kitchen that night, and it was different from the hurt I'd felt 18 months earlier. The hurt from the breakup was soft. It was the kind of pain that comes from losing something you loved. From having to revise the future you'd built in your head. This was harder. This was the anger of understanding that you were never quite in the story you thought you were in, that while you were being real, someone else was running a different script. But I also want to tell you something else. Something that I think is important if any of this is going to mean anything beyond just a good story for a Thursday night on the internet. I stood at that window, and underneath the anger, underneath the cold clarity of what I now knew, there was something else. Something quieter. Something that felt almost like relief. Because it wasn't my fault. I know that sounds simple. I know it sounds like something you'd read on a motivational poster above a water cooler somewhere. But when you've spent 18 months doing the quiet, unglamorous work of wondering what you could have done differently, wondering if you weren't driven enough, present enough, ambitious enough, and then you find out that the ending was written before you ever got to that chapter, there's a specific kind of weight that lifts. It wasn't my failure. It was her choice. There's a difference. And that difference matters more than I can explain. Marcus and I sat at that table until almost 1 a.m. We talked about Darnell and what protections he'd need. We talked about David Kim, my lawyer, who I was going to need to loop in. We talked about the wedding, October 14th, 3 weeks away, and what, if anything, I was going to do with an invitation that had been sent to humiliate me. At some point, Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the one he got when he was about to say something that was true, but that he'd held back long enough that it had built up pressure. "Are you going to go?" he asked. "To the wedding?" "Yeah." I turned the beer bottle slowly between my palms. I don't know yet. What would be the point? I don't know that either. He nodded slowly. You know she sent that invitation to make you feel like nothing. Yeah. And you know that if you show up, however you show up, it's going to be the last time she ever tries something like that. I looked at him. He wasn't smiling exactly. It was something more subtle than that. The look of a man who already knew how the story ended and was waiting patiently for you to catch up. Get some sleep, he said, and call David in the morning. I drove home through empty streets with the windows down again. The city was different at that hour, quieter, more honest, like it had taken off whatever it wore during the day and was just being itself for a few hours before sunrise. I parked the Honda in the lot and sat in it for a few minutes with the engine off. I thought about my grandmother Evelyn, about her voice in that hospital room, about the promise I'd made her, about 7 years of keeping my word to a woman who couldn't see me keeping it anymore, and how that had somehow still felt like the rightest thing I'd ever done. I thought about Trevor Montgomery billing insurance companies for complications that never existed, in a hospital where people went to be healed. I thought about Brittany writing, "I'm not built for ordinary 4 days," before handing me back a ring that a 78-year-old man said had a good feeling. And I thought about October 14th, Napa Valley, a vineyard ceremony with 200 guests and an open bar and a bride who had sent a handwritten note to a man she thought was nobody, never imagining for a single second that he might show up as something else entirely. I went upstairs. I made a second cup of tea. I sat in front of my grandmother's framed photo on the desk and just looked at her face for a while. Then I picked up my phone and I typed a text to David Kim. I need to meet tomorrow. It's important. Bring your calendar. We have about 3 weeks. He responded in 40 seconds, which was David's version of urgency. 8 a.m., my office. I'll have coffee. I put the phone down. I looked at the invitation still sitting on the kitchen counter, that cream-colored envelope with the gold calligraphy and the wrong name written on the front. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and for the first time since I'd found it in the mailbox, for the first time in 18 months, honestly, I smiled. Not a happy smile exactly. More like the specific smile you have when you realize that a situation you thought was happening to you is actually happening for you. That the universe occasionally has a sense of dramatic timing that no screenwriter could manufacture on purpose. She had sent me an invitation, and I was going to RSVP. David Kim's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Market Street that had the kind of lobby that made you stand up straighter just walking through it. All marble floors and high ceilings and the specific echo of expensive decisions being made somewhere above you at all hours of the day. I'd been coming here for 7 years. I knew the security guard by name. Gerald, early 60s, always had a crossword puzzle folded in his shirt pocket, never finished them because he said finishing them felt like saying goodbye to something. I knew which elevator was slowest. I knew that David's assistant, a young woman named Patricia who wore her natural hair in the most elaborate protective styles I had ever seen, a different one every single week, each one more architectural than the last, always had the coffee ready before you sat down. If David had told her it was an important meeting, the coffee was ready when I walked in. Patricia looked up from her desk and gave me the specific nod that meant he's already in there and he's already thinking. I straightened my jacket. I'd worn an actual jacket, dark navy, because something about the morning felt like it required it, and pushed open the heavy door to David's office. David Kim was 51 years old and looked 43 and dressed like he was 40. He was the kind of man whose entire physical presence communicated precision. Medium height, lean, silver starting at his temples, in a way that looked less like aging and more like a deliberate design choice. He wore glasses with thin tortoiseshell frames that he only put on when he was reading something that required his full attention. And when he took them off, it meant he was done with the documents and ready to talk. He was wearing the glasses when I walked in. He took them off the moment I sat down. "Tell me everything," he said. No preamble, no small talk. David Kim had never in 7 years asked me how I was doing before getting to the point. And I respected that about him the way you respect a surgeon who doesn't make jokes before the procedure. So I told him everything. The invitation, the note, Marcus, the emails, Darnell, the hard drive, the 47 cases, and the $2.3 million. I talked for almost 20 minutes without stopping. David sat across from me with both hands flat on his desk and his eyes steady on mine the whole time, the way he always listened, completely, with his whole body, like the information was something physical that he was receiving and cataloging in real time. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. "All right," he said. "Let's talk about what we're actually dealing with here, because these are two completely separate situations, and they need to be handled completely separately." He drew a clean line down the center of his legal pad, dividing it in two columns. "On the left," he said, tapping the pen, "we have a personal matter. An ex-fiancé who treated you badly, who has continued to treat you badly, and who has now sent you a formal invitation to witness what she believes is her triumph over your inadequacy." He said it plainly, without softening it, which I appreciated. David never softened things. "On the right," he continued, tapping the other column, "we have a potential federal matter. Insurance fraud, if Darnell's documentation holds up, falls under Title 18 of the U.S. Code. This is not a civil issue. This is not something that gets settled quietly. If what your friend has compiled is what you're describing, we're talking about a criminal referral to the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, possibly the FBI, depending on the scale, and whether any federal programs like Medicare or Medicaid were involved in the billing." He looked up at me. "Were they? I don't know yet. Marcus is checking with Darnell." David wrote something on the right side of the pad. "Get me that information today, and get me the hard drive. I need to have our forensic accountant look at this before we do anything. If the documentation is clean and the numbers hold, this goes to the right people through the right channels. Darnell gets protected. His name stays out of it as long as legally possible." "He's been scared about exposure," I said. "That's a reasonable fear. But there are whistleblower protections under the False Claims Act that are specifically designed for situations like this. If this goes where I think it might go, Darnell may actually be entitled to a portion of any government recovery. We're going to do this right." I nodded. There was something steadying about watching David work, about watching a man who was genuinely excellent at something apply that excellence to a problem in real time. "Now," he said, shifting his pen to the left column, "the personal matter." He leaned back slightly. This was the only tell David Kim had. When he was moving from legal strategy to something more human, he leaned back exactly 1 inch, like he was giving the conversation slightly more air. "What do you want?" "Joseph, not what you want to happen to them. What do you want for yourself out of October 14th? I thought about that. I'd been thinking about it since I sat in the Honda in the parking lot at 1 in the morning, but I hadn't put it into clean language yet. "I want to close the chapter," I said, "completely on my own terms." Meaning she sent that invitation to make me feel like nothing, and I want to show up as everything, not to rub it in her face, or, okay, maybe a little bit to rub it in her face, but mostly because I have spent 7 years being intentionally invisible, and I think I'm done with that now." David considered this for a moment. "And after October 14th, I go public. LearnBridge comes back. The foundation I've been running anonymously gets a name. I step out of the background. Your grandmother's 10 years are up in 2 months," he said quietly. "I know." He nodded, wrote something on the left side of the pad. Then he looked up and did something I had never seen David Kim do in 7 years of professional relationship. He smiled. Not a big smile. A small, precise David Kim smile, barely a change in the set of his mouth, but completely unmistakable. "Then let's make sure October 14th is worth remembering," he said. "The next 3 weeks were the most deliberately lived 21 days of my life. I want to be clear about something before I describe what happened during that time, because I don't want you to picture some movie montage of a man transforming himself for revenge. That's not what it was. I wasn't trying to become someone different. I was trying to let the someone I'd already been, quietly, privately for 7 years, finally take up the space he'd earned. There's a difference. It feels different from the inside. One is performance, the other is permission. The first call I made after leaving David's office was to Gloria Reyes, my financial advisor. Gloria was 55 years old and had the specific energy of a woman who had spent 3 decades in rooms where she was underestimated and had converted every single one of those experiences into fuel. She wore her hair in a low bun that she'd been wearing since approximately 1987, and she had a laugh that arrived about 2 seconds after the joke landed. Like she was verifying it first before committing. I told her I needed to move some things. "How much are we talking?" she asked. "Enough to make an entrance." She laughed. 2-second delay, right on schedule. "Joseph Wright," she said. "I have been waiting 7 years for you to say something like that. I won't take you through every day of those 3 weeks, but I'll give you the moments that mattered." On day 3, Marcus brought Darnell to meet David in person. Darnell was a quiet man in his late 30s with careful eyes and the slightly compressed posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had learned to carry it without letting it show. He brought the hard drive and a printed summary he'd put together himself. 12 pages organized by date and case number, with a methodology section explaining how he'd identified the irregularities. David read the methodology section in real time, right there at the table, glasses on, pen moving. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Darnell. "This is thorough," he said. The way David said thorough made it sound like the highest possible compliment, which coming from him, it was. "I just wrote down what I saw," Darnell said. "That's all it takes," David said. "Most people don't bother." He set the document aside and told Darnell exactly what was going to happen next. The forensic accountant review, the whistleblower filing, the timeline, the protections. Darnell sat straighter in his chair with every sentence. By the time David finished, that compressed posture had opened up slightly, like a man who had been told he was allowed to put down the thing he'd been carrying. On day 7, I called Tom Nguyen. Tom Nguyen was a custom tailor in Center City who had been making suits for Philadelphia's quiet money for 22 years. I had met him once before, shortly after the Lurnbridge sale, when I'd gone to him for a single suit that I told myself was just to have something appropriate for formal occasions. He was a small Vietnamese-American man, 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved over fabric the way a musician's hands move over an instrument, completely certain, no wasted motion. He remembered me. "Mr. Wright," he said when I walked in. 7 years. "I need something for a wedding," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Not at my clothes, but at me, the way tailors sometimes do, like they're reading something underneath the surface measurements. "What kind of wedding?" he asked. I thought about how to answer that. "The kind," I said finally, "where the groom doesn't know I'm coming and the bride is going to wish she hadn't sent the invitation." Tom Nguyen nodded slowly, like this was a perfectly normal brief for a suit commission. He reached for his measuring tape. "I have a black wool silk blend from a mill in Naples," he said. "Arrived last month. I've been waiting for the right reason to cut it." "That sounds right," I said. He measured me for 45 minutes with the focused silence of a man who understood that some garments were functional and some were statements, and that the difference between the two was in the details, the pick stitching on the lapel, the way the shoulder seam sat exactly at the edge of the bone, the half-inch of shirt cuff visible below the jacket sleeve. When I left his shop, I already felt different, not because of the suit, it wasn't even made yet, but because of the decision. Because of the permission I'd given myself to stop shrinking. On day 12, David called me. The forensic accountant had completed the preliminary review of Darnell's documentation. The numbers held. Better than held. They were, in the accountant's words, conservatively documented, meaning Darnell had actually been careful not to flag anything he wasn't absolutely certain about, which meant the real number could be higher. Medicare and Medicaid billing was involved in at least 19 of the 47 cases. That made it federal. David had already been in quiet contact with the HHS Office of Inspector General through a colleague. The whistleblower filing was being prepared. Darnell's identity was protected. The timeline for any official action was uncertain. These things moved at their own pace, and David was careful to tell me not to expect anything dramatic by October 14th. "This isn't about October 14th, he said. "This is about doing the right thing with information that Darnell trusted you with, Whatever happens on the 14th, that's separate. I know, I said. Do you? David. I'm asking because I want to make sure you're going to that wedding for the right reasons. I thought about it honestly, the way he deserved me to think about it. I'm going, I said, because she sent me a note calling me poor thing and telling me I'd never made anything of myself. And because for 18 months I thought maybe she was right, not about the money but about me, about who I was. And I need to close that door, not for her, for me. Silence on the line. All right, David said, then close it properly. On day 18, Tom Nguyen called to say the suit was ready for the final fitting. I went in on a Tuesday evening after school, still in my teacher clothes. Khakis, a plaid shirt, the worn leather messenger bag. Tom had the suit on a wooden hanger near the window where the evening light came in at an angle that made the wool-silk blend look almost liquid. I put it on. Tom made 2 tiny adjustments. A single stitch at the back of the right shoulder. A slight tapering at the waist that was barely visible but that changed the entire silhouette. Then he stepped back and looked at me with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted. Yes, he said simply. In the way that people who don't waste words use the word yes. I looked in the 3-way mirror. And I know this sounds like something from a movie, but I want to be honest with you all. I didn't recognize myself at first. Not because I looked different exactly, but because I looked like the version of myself I'd been keeping in storage for 7 years. The version my grandmother had asked me to wait on. And standing there in Tom Nguyen's shop in the evening light, I thought, she would have liked this. Not the suit, the timing, the patience it took to get here. I paid Tom. I carried the suit in its garment bag to the Honda and laid it carefully across the back seat. 3 days left. On day 20, Marcus called me at 10 at night. You need to know something before Saturday, he said. What? I talked to Cynthia Park again today. She's been in contact with some of the other women in Brittany's circle. Apparently, Trevor's been, he paused, choosing the word carefully, not faithful, during the engagement. Multiple times. Brittany doesn't know, or if she knows, she's chosen not to know. I sat with that for a moment. Marcus, that's between them. That's not I know, he said quickly. I'm not suggesting you do anything with it. I just wanted you to go in with the full picture, because I don't want you walking in there thinking she's living some perfect life that she chose over you. I want you to know exactly what she actually chose. I understood what he was doing. It wasn't cruelty toward Brittany. It was care toward me. He was making sure I didn't spend one more second measuring myself against a fiction. Thank you, I said. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow you fly to California. I had booked a private charter flight through a service that David's office used occasionally for client travel. It was not something I had ever done before in my life, and I want to tell you that I sat in that small, immaculate cabin on the morning of October 14th. Leather seats, a window with actual legroom, a flight attendant who brought me sparkling water without me asking. And I felt something that I can only describe as the specific strangeness of finally letting yourself have something you've always been capable of having. Not luxury for its own sake, not showing off, just space, just room. I looked out the window at Philadelphia getting smaller beneath me, the grid of streets, the curve of the Schuylkill, the neighborhoods I knew block by block, and I thought about 5th grade Madison explaining her math solution to the class, and Mrs. Rodriguez's shopping cart at 6:15 p.m., and the flickering light above the mailboxes, and a cream-colored envelope with the wrong name written on it in gold calligraphy. And I thought, I am still that man. All of this is still me. Nothing is being replaced. Something is just finally being completed. The flight attendant asked if I needed anything. I'm good, I said, thank you. And I meant both things completely. We touched down in Napa Valley at 2:47 in the afternoon. The ceremony was at 5. The car David had arranged, and yes, I know how it sounds, but David had insisted, said something about making an entrance that matches the moment in the most David Kim way possible, was a Rolls-Royce Ghost, in a color that Tom Nguyen, when I described it to him, had called midnight without the blue. The driver, a quiet man named Carlos who had the professional composure of someone who had driven many people to many important moments and understood that his job was to be invisible until he wasn't needed and then present exactly when he was, handed me a bottle of water as I got in. I looked at the suit. I looked at the vineyard hills rolling past the window, golden in the late afternoon California sun. I thought about 7 words spoken in a kitchen in Germantown on a Thursday night. She was already talking to Trevor before she left you. I thought about 47 cases, about a man who had billed for suffering that didn't exist and pocketed the difference. I thought about a note that said, "Poor thing, and finally make something of yourself and bring a date if you can find someone willing." The car turned onto the private road leading to the vineyard estate. Through the window I could see the tent, the flowers, the assembled guests moving in their formal wear across the manicured grounds. I could see valets. I could see a string quartet near the garden entrance. Carlos slowed the car at the main gate. "Mr. Wright," he said, "we've arrived." I straightened my jacket. I checked my cufflinks. Simple silver had belonged to my grandfather. I looked out at the estate where a woman who had called me poor thing was about to become the wife of a man whose entire empire was built on lies. And I opened the door. The gravel made a specific sound under my shoe. I don't know why that detail stayed with me. But it did. That first step out of the car, the sound of expensive gravel under a leather sole, crisp and deliberate, like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. The California afternoon air hit me differently than Philadelphia air. Warmer, drier, carrying the faint sweetness of the vineyard rows that stretched out on either side of the estate in long, orderly lines, the leaves already turning at the edges with the first suggestion of autumn. Carlos closed the car door behind me with a soft, definitive click. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds. I counted them, not consciously, but later I remembered counting, and I took in the full picture of where I was. The estate was the kind of place that understood its own beauty and had arranged itself accordingly. A long stone path led from the main gate to the ceremony area, flanked by cypress trees that stood so straight and tall, they looked less like trees and more like a formal escort. The tent at the far end was ivory with open sides, filled with flowers I couldn't name, but that were clearly chosen by someone who charged by the stem. Round tables were visible through the opening, draped in white linen, with centerpieces that caught the late afternoon light in a way that looked choreographed. There were easily 200 people moving across the grounds. Women in floor-length gowns, men in black tie, waitstaff in white jackets moving through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes that caught the sun like small moving fires. And standing about 40 feet from the main gate, slightly apart from the assembled guests with a camera bag over one shoulder and a full-frame camera raised to her eye, was a woman photographing the cypress trees. Not the guests, not the flowers, not the tent, the trees. I noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't fit the pattern of everything else. Not because she was out of place exactly, but because she was operating at a completely different frequency than everyone around her. While 200 people in formal wear socialized and positioned themselves and did the specific performance that expensive weddings require, this woman was standing in the long grass at the edge of the stone path, shoes probably getting damp, photographing the way the afternoon light was cutting through the cypress branches at an angle that, I had to admit, was genuinely worth photographing. She was wearing what I would later learn was her standard working uniform: black trousers, a simple white button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair pulled back in a low twist that had started the day neat and was beginning, beautifully, to come apart at the edges. She had a second lens in a pouch on her belt and a small notepad tucked in her back pocket, which I thought was an unusual thing for a photographer to carry until I learned why she did. I was still standing by the car taking in the scene when she lowered the camera and turned around and found me standing there. I want to describe this moment accurately because it wasn't dramatic in the way that moments in movies are dramatic. There was no slow motion, there was no swelling music. There was just a woman with a camera who turned around and saw a man standing by a Rolls-Royce in a custom suit, looking at the cypress trees she'd just been photographing, and she tilted her head slightly, a fraction, barely a degree, the way people do when something interrupts the thought they were in the middle of. Then she went back to looking through her viewfinder. Not at me. Back at the trees. I don't know exactly why that made me smile, but it did. I started walking down the stone path toward the ceremony area, doing the thing I'd planned to do, walking calmly, unhurried, in the direction of the assembled guests, letting the moment arrive in its own time. I had not come here to announce myself. I had come here to simply be visible, to exist in this space as myself, fully, and let that be enough. I was about 10 feet past her when she spoke. "Could you move slightly to the left?" I stopped, turned around. She was looking at me through the camera now, not at the trees, at me, or rather at the composition I'd accidentally walked into, because I had apparently positioned myself between the late sun and the cypress row in a way that was creating a shadow she didn't want in her frame. "Sorry," I said. I took 2 steps to the left. She took the shot, lowered the camera, looked at the screen on the back, tilting it slightly against the light. "Thank you," she said. Then, after a half-second pause, she looked up at me directly for the first time. "You're not a guest, are you?" It wasn't quite a question. "I am, actually," I said. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between curiosity and the careful professional neutrality of someone who had learned to observe without reacting. "You're standing outside the party looking at the venue like you're trying to memorize it. Guests don't do that, they're too busy being seen." "Maybe I'm just slow," I said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. Maybe. She reached into the bag over her shoulder and pulled out a second camera body, smaller, different lens, and started checking its settings with the brisk efficiency of someone who had 12 things to do and was already behind on 2 of them. "Ava Reeves," she said without looking up from the camera. "Photographer, hired by the family." "Joseph Wright," I said, "invited by the bride." She looked up at that. And this time the expression was more readable. The specific look of someone who has just received a piece of information that recontextualizes something they'd already noticed. "Invited by the bride," she repeated. "Is that interesting to you?" "Everything's interesting to me," she said simply. "It's a job requirement." She slung the camera bag back over her shoulder and looked at me for a moment with those careful, observational eyes. Dark brown. The kind that seemed to be taking in more information per second than most people's. The kind that belonged to someone who had spent years training herself to see what was actually in front of her, rather than what she expected to find. "You look like you're bracing for something," she said. "Do I?" "Not in a bad way, more like—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Like someone about to have a conversation they've been writing in their head for a long time." I looked at her. "You get that from a photograph?" "I get it from standing here," she said. "Photographs just confirm what I already see." She turned and walked toward the tent, camera raised again, back to work, leaving me standing on the stone path with the cypress trees and the late afternoon light and the particular sensation of having been read more accurately by a stranger in 90 seconds than by someone I'd known for 3 years. I composed myself and walked toward the ceremony area. The moment I stepped into the periphery of the gathered guests, I felt the shift. It wasn't immediate. It rippled outward the way a stone in still water does, one ring at a time. A woman near the champagne table glanced at me and then glanced again. 2 men in conversation turned their heads with that involuntary reflex people have when something enters their visual field that doesn't match their existing expectations. A wedding planner with a headset and a clipboard froze mid-stride about 15 feet away and stared with the expression of someone rapidly recalculating a seating chart in their head. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, not champagne, I wanted to be clear-headed, and moved through the crowd at an unhurried pace, nodding to people who made eye contact, doing absolutely nothing dramatic. I had been here for 4 minutes when I saw her. Brittany was standing near the entrance to the tent with 3 women I recognized vaguely from her social media, part of the carefully curated circle she'd assembled around herself over the years. Each one selected, I now understood, with the same calculated precision she applied to everything else in her life. She was in a wedding gown that had clearly cost a significant amount of money, fitted, architectural, The kind of dress that required a team of people to put on, with her hair in an elaborate updo that had small white flowers woven through it. She looked exactly like the life she'd been building toward. She had not seen me yet. I was about 30 feet away, partially obscured by a cluster of guests, when the woman to Brittany's left, a tall blonde with a glass of champagne, shifted her gaze in my direction and went still. Brittany noticed the stillness. She followed the woman's line of sight. And she found me. I want to tell you what her face did because I think it's important to be honest about what that moment felt like from the inside. I think some of you reading this might expect me to say it felt triumphant, like winning, like a door slamming on the right side. It didn't feel like that. What it felt like was quieter than that. It felt like setting down something I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was, like the specific exhale after a long period of held breath. Because what happened to Brittany's face in that moment was not simple. It wasn't just shock. Though the shock was there, the champagne glass stilled in her hand, the color in her face shifting in a way that her foundation couldn't quite cover, her eyes doing that rapid recalibration that happens when the brain receives information it has absolutely no prepared response for. It was something more than shock. It was recognition, not just of me, of what she'd miscalculated, of the gap between the story she'd been telling herself for 18 months and the reality now standing 40 feet away in a Tom Nguyen suit next to a Rolls-Royce that was still visible through the garden entrance. I didn't move toward her. I didn't gesture. I didn't smile in a way that could be read as cruelty. I simply looked at her. The way you look at someone when you have finally, completely stopped needing anything from them. And then I looked away. The ceremony was at 5 o'clock. I sat in the last row as I had planned, not to hide, but because sitting in the last row gave me the full view of everything, the way directors sit at the back of the theater to see the whole stage at once. The string quartet played something classical and precise. The cypress trees were gold in the fading light. Trevor Montgomery walked to the altar and I saw him for the first time in person. He was tall, taller than I'd expected from the photos, with the particular physical confidence of a man who had always been considered impressive and had organized his entire personality around that fact. Broad shoulders, silver at his temples in a way that looked expensive, a jaw that could have been designed specifically to inspire trust in patients sitting across a consultation desk. He stood at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him and his chin slightly elevated. And he looked exactly like a man who believed that this moment, this specific arrangement of flowers and guests and California light, was entirely his due. He had no idea. I thought about Darnell's 12 pages, about 47 cases, about Medicare billing codes and anesthesia logs and the specific kind of confidence it takes to build a life on a foundation of fabricated suffering. I looked at Trevor Montgomery standing at that altar, and I felt nothing like hatred. Hatred would have required me to give him more of myself than he deserved. What I felt was closer to something cold and settled, the same feeling I'd had standing at Marcus's kitchen window at 1 a.m. Clarity. Brittany walked down the aisle on her father's arm. She didn't look at me as she passed, but I saw her jaw set in that particular way it did when she was working hard to control something. I'd seen it enough times over 3 years to recognize it anywhere. The slight tension just below the cheekbone, the extra deliberateness of each step. She was holding it together, but she was working to do it. The ceremony itself was 40 minutes. I'll spare you the details of vows that I now understood were being made by two people who had each, in their own way, been performing a version of themselves for the other. When the officiant said, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," I heard a small, stifled sound from somewhere in the middle rows. Later Marcus, who had flown in separately and was sitting 6 rows ahead of me, would tell me he'd almost laughed out loud at the timing, but I said nothing. I hadn't come to stop a wedding. When it was over and the guests moved toward the reception tent, I walked to the edge of the vineyard. I needed a moment outside the crowd, outside the performance of it all, just to stand in the actual air and let the evening settle around me. That's where Ava found me. She was carrying her smaller camera, and she had the look of someone between shots, present but temporarily untethered from the next task. She came and stood about 6 feet away from me, not looking at me but at the rows of vines, the way they ran in long parallel lines toward the darkening hills. "You were in the last row," she said. "I was. And you didn't say anything during the—" She paused, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. The pause. "No." She turned and looked at me. The evening light was different now. Lower, more golden. The kind of light that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than experienced. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You've been doing that since we met." "Fair." She looked back at the vines. "Why did you come, really?" I thought about how to answer that. I'd been asked versions of this question by Marcus, by David, by myself at 1 a.m. in a dark parking lot. But something about the way she asked it, without agenda, without anything riding on the answer, purely as someone who was genuinely curious about the honest version, made me want to actually answer it. "Because she sent me an invitation telling me I'd never amounted to anything," I said, and I needed to know if that still hurt, whether I'd actually moved past it or just convinced myself I had. "And," she said, and I walked in here and I looked at her and I felt nothing, not nothing like emptiness, nothing like freedom. Ava was quiet for a moment. She raised the camera and took a photo of the vines. One shot, deliberate, unhurried. "What do you do?" she asked. "When you're not attending weddings of people who underestimated you?" "I teach 5th grade," I said. She lowered the camera and looked at me. "In that suit?" "Different suit for school," I said. She laughed, and the laugh was unexpected, not performed or polished. It was the kind of laugh that arrives before the person can decide whether to let it, genuine and unguarded, over almost as soon as it started, leaving a warmth in the air where it had been. "Okay, Joseph Wright," she said. "I need to go photograph the first dance, but—" She paused, and I saw something shift in her expression, something slightly more careful and slightly more real than the professional composure she'd been wearing all evening. "Don't disappear before I finish working." I looked at her. "I'll be here," I said, and I meant it in more ways than I understood yet. The reception was in full motion, champagne, dancing, the specific orchestrated joy of an expensive wedding working exactly as expensive weddings are designed to work, when I felt my phone buzz in my breast pocket. A text from David Kim, sent at 7:43 p.m. California time. "Forensic review complete. Filing goes in Monday morning. Thought you should know before the evening was over. Enjoy California." I read it twice, put the phone back in my pocket, stood for a moment at the edge of the tent, watching the dance floor where Trevor Montgomery was moving with the comfortable ease of a man who believed the ground under his feet was solid. Monday morning, 2 days from now. I thought about Darnell, who had spent over a year carrying something heavy and was now about to put it down through the right channels. I thought about 47 patients whose suffering had been used as billing line items. I thought about the specific kind of justice that doesn't arrive with noise, that arrives quietly, officially, in the form of a filing reference number on a Monday morning. Trevor spun Brittany on the dance floor. She laughed at something he said. Her flowers were perfect. The tent was glowing. The string quartet had transitioned to something with a jazz feeling that worked better than I expected. I watched them for exactly 30 seconds, and then I went to find Ava. She was near the edge of the tent, changing lenses with the focused efficiency I was already starting to recognize as characteristic. Quick, precise, no wasted motion. She had a small smear of something on her left wrist, which I would later learn was a permanent feature of any workday, a consequence of touching things while she was thinking. "You're still here," she said without looking up from the lens. I said I would be. She looked up then, and there was a moment, brief, maybe 3 seconds, where neither of us said anything, and the sounds of the reception continued around us. And the California evening was settling into that deep, specific blue that happens right before full dark, and I was suddenly very aware of standing exactly where I was, in exactly this moment, with exactly this person. "I'm almost done," she said. "1 more hour." "I'm not in a hurry," I said. She held my gaze for a beat longer than strictly necessary. "There's a place about 2 miles down the road," she said. "Small, local, good wine, Not the kind that comes with a tasting menu and a story about the soil. Just good wine and food that tastes like someone actually cooked it. That sounds perfect, I said. She went back to the lens. But I saw the corner of her mouth move again. That not quite smile that I was already learning was more meaningful than most people's full ones. 1 hour, she said. I stepped outside the tent. The vineyard was fully dark now, the hills just visible as shapes against the sky. Somewhere inside, Trevor Montgomery was dancing with a woman who had chosen him the way you choose a financial instrument, carefully, deliberately for what he represented rather than who he was. And in 2 days a filing would go through a government office in Washington that would begin the slow, methodical dismantling of everything he'd built on fabricated numbers. I thought about Brittany's note one more time. Poor thing. Finally make something of yourself. I looked up at the California sky, clear. Enormous, the kind of sky that Philadelphia's buildings don't let you see properly. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel standing on this particular ground, on this particular night. Gratitude. Not for what she'd done, but for what it had led me here to find. Because if she hadn't sent that invitation, if she hadn't written that note with its gold-tipped cruelty and its wrong name, I would be in my apartment in West Philadelphia right now, drinking red bush tea in front of a window that faced a brick wall, and I would never have stood in this vineyard at this hour talking to a woman who photographed cypress trees and laughed without deciding to first. Sometimes the thing meant to diminish you ends up delivering you exactly where you needed to go. I put my hands in my pockets. I looked at the stars. I waited for Ava Reeves. The place Ava had mentioned was called Mira's. Not Mira's Kitchen or Mira's Wine Bar or anything that tried to explain itself before you walked in. Just Mira's, in hand-painted letters on a wooden sign above a door that was slightly too short for the frame. So that when you pushed it open, you stepped into the warm interior with a small, involuntary ducking motion that felt somehow appropriate, like the place required you to humble yourself just slightly upon entry. It was 11 tables, maybe 12. The kind of restaurant where the space between tables is narrow enough that you're aware of the conversations happening around you. But the ambient noise, the low music, the sound of the kitchen, the particular murmur of people genuinely enjoying themselves, creates enough cover that your own conversation feels private anyway. The walls were rough plaster painted the color of old mustard, hung with photographs that looked like they'd been collected over decades rather than curated in an afternoon. The lighting came from fixtures that looked like repurposed mason jars, and it cast everything in a warm amber that made the whole room feel like it existed slightly outside of time. The woman at the host stand was in her 60s, with silver hair cut short and the particular ease of someone who had run a room like this for long enough that she no longer needed to try. She saw Ava and her face opened immediately, the specific warmth of genuine recognition, not professional hospitality. Ava. She reached across and squeezed her arm. Long day? Good long, Ava said. She glanced at me. This is Joseph. The woman, I would learn her name was Rosaria, and that she had opened Mira's 23 years ago after her mother. Mira, passed and left her a small inheritance and an instruction to do something that feeds people, looked at me with the same frank assessment she probably applied to everything that came through her door. You look like you just came from something formal, she said. Wedding, I said. Yours? No. She considered this. Good, she said, and led us to a corner table near the window. We sat down and Ava set her camera bag on the empty chair beside her, with the careful, automatic motion of someone who has done that 10,000 times. The bag never goes on the floor, never gets hung over the chair back. Always goes on a surface where she can see it. She pulled the notepad from her back pocket and set it on the table, which I'd been curious about since I first noticed it. You take notes? I asked. She looked at the pad, then at me, as if she'd forgotten it was there. I write down what I see, not for captions or anything professional, just things I notice. Details I don't want to lose. Like what? She opened it to a page from earlier that evening. Her handwriting was small and slanted, the kind that covers a lot of ground quickly. She read without self-consciousness. Groom's left shoe slightly scuffed at the toe. Bride's smile doesn't reach above her cheekbones. Man in last row arrived in car that cost more than the venue. Cypress trees know something the guests don't. She closed the pad. I looked at her. You wrote that about me, I said. The car. I write about everything I see. What did you think it meant? The car. She tilted her head. I didn't assign it a meaning. I just wrote it down. Meanings come later sometimes. Rosaria brought wine without being asked. A local red, poured into glasses that were simple and wide, the kind designed for the wine rather than the impression. She set down a small plate of something. Bread, oil, a soft cheese that smelled faintly of herbs, and disappeared back toward the kitchen. I picked up the glass. The wine was exactly what Ava had promised. No ceremony, no story about the soil, just something honest and full and present. So, Ava said. She was looking at me with that same careful attention she'd given the cypress trees, like I was a subject she was deciding how to frame. Are you going to tell me what tonight was actually about? Because I photographed that wedding for 6 hours and I've been trying to figure it out since the moment you stepped out of that car. What have you figured out so far? That the bride knows you, that she did not expect to see you, that whatever happened between you was not small. She paused. And that you came here tonight not to do anything dramatic, but just to exist in that space, as yourself, which is actually the most dramatic thing you could have done. I looked at her for a long moment. You're very good at your job, I said. I'm a photographer. My job is to see what's actually in front of me. She broke off a piece of bread. Most people aren't that comfortable being seen. You are, that's unusual. Is it? Completely. She looked at the wine glass, turned it slightly. Most men I meet, especially men who've been through something hard, they present themselves. They show you the version that survived. They don't show you the version that got hurt. And you think you're seeing the version that got hurt? I think I'm seeing a man who stopped hiding both of them, she said. Which is different. The kitchen sounds filtered through from somewhere behind the wall, the specific rhythm of a working kitchen, the clatter and the heat of it, people making something real. Outside the narrow window beside our table, the vineyard hills were shapes in the dark, and every now and then the headlights of a car on the distant road swept briefly across the lower slopes. Her name was Brittany, I said. And then I told her. Not everything, not the full architecture of it, not Darnell and the hard drive and David Kim's legal pad, but the shape of it, the 3 years, the ring from Mr. Thuk, the Tuesday evening on the edge of the couch, the 18 months of quiet life in West Philadelphia, while she built her perfect narrative, and he honored a promise to a woman who wasn't there to see him keeping it. The invitation with the wrong name and the gold calligraphy and the words poor thing written in that precise backward slant. Ava listened the way very few people listen, completely, without preparing her response while I was still talking, without performing sympathy or filling the pauses with reassurances. She just listened. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass slowly between her palms. What was the promise? She asked. The one to your grandmother. I smiled. Out of everything I'd said, that was what she caught. To stay grounded, I said. To stay in real work with real people, real. To not let money change who I was. And did it? Change you? I thought about that honestly. I think it changed what I was willing to tolerate, I said. Not in an arrogant way. Just, when you know your own value, certain things stop being tolerable. Not because you think you're better than other people, but because you understand that you deserve the same honesty you give. Ava looked at me for a long moment. Your grandmother sounds like she was remarkable, she said. She was the most grounded person I've ever known. She had this way of saying the most profound things in the most ordinary voice. Like she wasn't aware they were profound. Like wisdom was just her resting state. What was her name? Evelyn. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away carefully. Tell me about teaching, she said then. And the shift was smooth, natural. Not a change of subject, but an expansion of it. Like she was filling in the full picture rather than moving to a different one. So I told her about room 502. About Madison and the geometry shapes hanging from the ceiling. About Tommy Martinez's diabetes treatment and his mother crying in the school office. About the Honda with the dent on the rear panel that I kept saying I'd fix. About Mrs. Rodriguez's shopping cart at 6:15 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and how that sound, that specific rolling sound across lobby tile, had become one of the most comforting sounds in my life because it meant someone I cared about was home safe. Ava smiled at the shopping cart detail. "You notice the sounds people make," she said. "I notice the visual details. We're doing the same thing." "What thing?" "Paying attention," she said simply. "To the real stuff. The stuff that tells you who people actually are." I need to tell you about Ava Reeves the way I understand her now because I think it matters for the rest of what I'm going to tell you. She was 31 years old and had been a photographer since she was 19, when she'd bought her first used camera at a pawn shop in Baltimore, with money she'd saved from a waitressing job, and taught herself from library books and online tutorials because she couldn't afford the classes. She'd built a reputation doing documentary work, not weddings primarily, though she did them sometimes when she needed the income, but the kind of photography that appeared in the back pages of magazines people actually read, the kind that made you stop turning pages. She had a son, 7 years old. His name was Miles, and from the way she said his name, not self-consciously, not as a warning or a disclaimer, but just with the same directness she applied to everything, I understood that he was the organizing principle of her entire life in the best possible way. "He's the reason I take the wedding jobs," she said. "The documentary work is what I love. The weddings pay Miles's school. Where is he tonight?" "My neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She's 83 years old and she insists on babysitting him because she says he's the only person under 70 who appreciates her cooking." I smiled. "What does she make?" "Scallion pancakes. He asks for them by name now." She looked briefly warm in a way that was different from the professional composure. Softer. More open. "He's going to be devastated when he learns that not all food is that good." She told me about his school play 2 months earlier. He'd played a tree, a non-speaking role, and had taken it so seriously that he'd researched actual tree species and delivered a pre-show presentation to Ava about why his tree would specifically be a red maple. She told me about the morning routine, the specific negotiation around breakfast foods, the backpack that was always losing one strap, the way he asked her the same question every morning as she dropped him off. "Do you have your camera?" Not, "I love you," as a goodbye, though that came too, but "Do you have your camera?" Because for Miles, the camera was the thing that meant she was fully herself, fully equipped, fully Ava. "He sounds like a remarkable kid," I said. "He's the best person I know," she said, which is both incredibly gratifying and completely humbling, because he's 7 and he's already better at most things than I am. I laughed. And the laugh surprised me. Genuine, unguarded, the kind that arrived before I decided to let it. She noticed, and she smiled. A full one this time. Not the corner of the mouth suggestion, but the real version, the one that changed her whole face and revealed a small gap between her 2 front teeth that was, without question, the most disarming thing about her. We stayed at Mira's until almost midnight. I know how that sounds. 2 people who met 3 hours ago, sitting in a restaurant in Napa Valley until midnight after a wedding neither of them wanted to be at. But it didn't feel fast, it felt like the opposite of fast. It felt like the specific ease of a conversation that had found its own pace early, and then settled into it comfortably. The way long drives settle once you're past the city traffic. We talked about her documentary work, a project she'd spent 2 years on in Baltimore, photographing the residents of a neighborhood facing demolition, which had resulted in a small book that had sold modestly and been reviewed generously, and that she was deeply proud of in the private way of someone who knows the value of something they made regardless of its commercial reception. We talked about LearnBridge. I told her about it plainly, without drama. The way you tell someone something true. About the graduate school apartment and the second-hand laptop and the 4 years of building and the sale and the $18 million and the woman in the hospital bed who asked me to stay grounded. She listened to all of it without her expression changing into the particular face people sometimes make when money enters a conversation. That slight recalibration. That almost imperceptible shift of register. She just absorbed it the same way she'd absorbed everything else I'd said. Like information about a person, not information about a balance sheet. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "The company, the money. Now that you're coming out of the quiet." "Relaunch LearnBridge," I said. "As a free platform for public schools. The ones like Franklin Elementary where I teach. The ones that can't afford the tools their students deserve." She was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother would have liked that," she said. And something about the simplicity of that, the directness of it, the fact that she went straight to Evelyn without any detour through how impressive it was or how generous or how remarkable, did something to my chest that I wasn't entirely prepared for. "Yeah," I said. "She would have." Rosaria came by to refill our water and gave us a look that communicated warmly, but unmistakably, that the kitchen was closing, but we were welcome to stay as long as we liked. We ordered one more glass of wine each and stayed another 40 minutes just talking. About Baltimore and Philadelphia. About public school systems and documentary ethics. About the specific loneliness of doing something you believe in, without external validation. About what it means to build a life that looks nothing like what people expected it to look like, and whether that's brave or just stubborn. "Both," Ava said. "Brave and stubborn, they're the same muscle." At 11:47 she looked at her phone and made a sound that was half surprise, half amusement. "Mrs. Chen just texted me. Miles asked if he could sleep there tonight." "How old is Mrs. Chen?" 83. And she said yes? She said, and I'm quoting directly, "Of course. He teaches me things." I shook my head slowly. "What does he teach her?" "Last week it was the rules of basketball. The week before, why red maples are specifically better than other maples." She smiled. "She's learning a lot." We walked out of Mira's at midnight into the cool California night. The Vineyard Road was quiet. No traffic, no sound from the estate up the hill where the wedding reception had presumably ended. Just the dark and the stars and the faint smell of the vines and the gravel under our feet. Ava had her camera bag over her shoulder, and her notepad in her hand and the half-composed expression of someone who has had a good evening and is already thinking about how to hold on to it without squeezing too hard. We stood next to her rental car, a sensible gray compact that had a small sticker on the bumper that said Red Maple in a child's handwriting, slightly crooked, applied with obvious care. I looked at the sticker. She saw me looking. "Miles," she said. I figured. She leaned against the car and looked up at the sky for a moment. "I have an early flight," she said, "back to Baltimore." "I have a charter back to Philadelphia," I said. "Afternoon." "Of course you do," she said, not unkindly, just noting it. I looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "You've been doing that since we met," she said, echoing my earlier words back to me with the small precision of someone who retains everything. "That notepad," I said. "What are you going to write about tonight?" She considered this for a moment. She opened the pad, uncapped the pen she kept clipped to the cover, and wrote something. Then she tore the page out with a clean single motion and handed it to me. I looked at it. Her handwriting. Small and slanted. Man who came to close a door found a window instead. Note. Red Maple. I looked up at her. "Red Maple?" I said. "Specifically better than other maples," she said, "according to my most reliable source." I folded the page carefully and put it in the breast pocket of the Tom Nguyen suit. Next to my phone, next to David's text about Monday morning and a filing that would begin the end of Trevor Montgomery's fabricated empire. "I'd like to call you," I said, "when I'm back in Philadelphia." She looked at me with those careful, seeing eyes. "I'd like that," she said, "but I want you to know something first." "Okay." Miles comes first. Always. Not as a warning, just as a fact. The most important fact about my life. "That's not a complication," I said. "That's a recommendation." She looked at me for a beat, then the full smile again, gap-toothed, unguarded, arriving before she decided to let it. "Good night, Joseph Wright," she said. "Good night, Ava Reeves," I said. She got in the car. I stood on the gravel road and watched the taillights of the gray compact move down the vineyard road until they turned and disappeared, and the night went quiet again. I stood there for a long moment. Above me, the California sky was doing what it does when no one is performing for it, just being enormous and clear, and full of more light than any one person can take in at once. I reached into my breast pocket and touched the folded notepad page. Man who came to close a door found a window instead. I thought about Brittany's face when she'd seen me. The champagne glass trembling. The color draining. The recognition of a miscalculation so fundamental it couldn't be corrected. I thought about Trevor on the dance floor, confident and unaware, 2 days from a Monday morning that would rearrange everything. I thought about Darnell, finally putting down what he'd been carrying. I thought about Marcus at his kitchen table in Germantown, hands flat on the surface, saying 7 words that changed the temperature of the room. I thought about my grandmother Evelyn, and a promise made in a hospital room, and 7 years of keeping it quietly, in a classroom with cardboard geometry shapes on the ceiling, and a parking lot where a fading blue Honda sat between newer cars. And I thought about a woman who photographed cypress trees and wrote things down so she wouldn't lose them. And a 7-year-old who researched red maples with academic seriousness and left stickers on bumpers with crooked handwriting applied with care. I walked back to the car where Carlos was waiting, patient and professional in the dark. "Ready, Mr. Wright?" he said. I looked at the sky one more time, or